He does not love me because he doesn't want to come with me. Why are you putting your hand in the camera? Y'all want me to record you? Huh? Exactly. Stop fucking playing with me. What's funny? What's funny?
I'm laughing because we laughing. Is we gonna make it 10 times worse?
A man doesn't just walk out a cigar lounge and end up dead without a chain of decisions, tensions, and moments that led there. And in the case of Khapri Alston, the silence around those moments has become almost as loud as the gunshots themselves. A father, a former professional athlete, a man who, according to his family, was unarmed and preparing to leave. Yet by the end of that night, he was lying in the street while the person who allegedly pulled the trigger sat in custody, uncharged. So the question that keeps coming up isn't just what happened. It's why. Why did this confrontation escalate to deadly force? Why did it end the way it did? And why, days later, is there still no clarity from the system meant to provide it? Let's be clear from the start. What we are discussing now are allegations, reported family claims, and publicly raised concerns, not legal conclusions. No charges have been filed. No official narrative has been released explaining what led to the shooting. But when authorities go quiet, speculation fills the vacuum. And in this case, that speculation is being fueled by patterns people recognize all too well. One of the central allegations circulating is that the fatal encounter involved the manager or owner of the cigar lounge. That claim has not been confirmed by police. What has been confirmed is that a confrontation occurred. Shots were fired as Khapri Alston was leaving, and one person was taken into custody shortly after. That's the factual baseline. Everything else exists in the space between what the public knows and what the authorities are not yet saying. So why are people pointing toward the lounge manager? First, control. In many establishments, particularly lounges operating late into the night, management has broad authority over who stays, who leaves, and how disputes are handled. When tensions rise, the manager is often the final decision-maker, the person who decides whether to de-escalate, call police, remove someone, or take matters into their own hands. When a shooting happens immediately outside the premises following a confrontation, people naturally begin asking whether authority was abused rather than exercised responsibly. Second, escalation. According to family statements, Khapri Alston was leaving. That detail matters. If someone is exiting a situation, the threat, real or perceived, is diminishing, not increasing, which raises a troubling question. What would justify pulling a trigger at that point? Self-defense claims become harder to reconcile when the alleged victim is walking away. Again, these are questions, not conclusions, but they are reasonable ones. Then there's the issue of power. Not just physical power, but social and political power. Khapri's family has publicly stated their fear that the person in custody has political ties and business interests that could influence how this case is handled. That fear did not come from nowhere. It came from lived experience in a town where political connections have historically shielded people from consequences. In communities like this, business owners aren't just business owners. They're donors. They're connected. They know trustees, officials, inspectors, decision-makers. And when violence intersects with influence, families learn very quickly that justice can slow to a crawl. Another possible motive people are discussing is reputation. Lounges live and die by their image. A public disturbance, especially one involving a high-profile individual, can threaten licenses, insurance, and long-term viability. In some cases, that pressure causes people to make catastrophic decisions, attempting to assert dominance, silence a situation, or handle internally rather than allowing law enforcement to take control. If that impulse existed here, it would explain why a moment of conflict ended in irreversible loss. And then there's the most uncomfortable possibility of all, ego, when authority is challenged, especially in public. Some people respond not with restraint, but with force. True crime history is full of cases where pride, not danger, drove deadly outcomes. A perceived slight, a refusal to back down, a need to show control. None of these justify violence, but they explain how it happens. What makes this case particularly disturbing is not just the shooting itself, but what followed. A suspect in custody, no charges, a grieving family forced to speak publicly just to keep the case visible, A father openly stating his fear that money and political influence could bury his son's death. That is not how justice is supposed to work. And yet, it's how it often does, quietly behind closed doors, while families wait and hope the system remembers their loved one was more than a file number. This is where the story truly begins. Not with a gunshot, but with what happens after. Because once a suspect is taken into custody and then quietly held without charges, the clock starts ticking in a way the public rarely notices. That window, the space between detention and prosecution, is where cases either solidify or slowly dissolve. Evidence gets reviewed, statements get clarified, narratives get shaped, and when the person in custody has resources, connections, or institutional familiarity, that window can stretch longer than it ever would for someone without them. Families feel that shift immediately. Phone calls slow, updates become vague. Phrases like ongoing investigation and pending review replace concrete timelines. And that is exactly why Khapri Alston's family chose to speak publicly as quickly as they did. Silence, in cases like this, is not neutral. Silence favors the system. Another question that continues to surface is whether this confrontation was truly spontaneous, or whether tensions had been building long before that night. Lounges are not neutral spaces. They have histories. They have regulars. They have staff dynamics. And when an establishment operates in an environment already strained by scrutiny, every disagreement carries extra weight. If Khapri was known, if his presence drew attention, if words were exchanged earlier in the night, those details matter. And yet, none of that information has been officially released. That lack of transparency fuels another possibility people are discussing: selective narrative control. When a shooting occurs involving a business owner or manager, there is often immediate concern about liability, civil suits, licensing consequences, insurance implications. In those situations, there can be immense pressure to frame the incident in a way that minimizes responsibility. That pressure doesn't require conspiracy. It only requires aligned interests. And aligned interests exist everywhere in local governance. Inspectors rely on cooperation. Municipalities rely on businesses for tax revenue. Officials rely on donors for campaigns. These relationships are not inherently corrupt, but they become dangerous when violence enters the equation. When a fatal shooting intersects with a web of professional familiarity, the public has every right to ask whether justice is being delayed to protect reputations rather than seek truth. That concern is not hypothetical. The town where this happened has a documented history of political dysfunction, alleged misuse of funds, and institutional breakdown. Residents watched as years of questionable leadership unfolded in plain sight, only for accountability to arrive late or not at all. So when Khapri's family says they fear the same dynamics are at play here, they are not speculating in a vacuum. They are responding to patterns they have already lived through. Another reason people suspect this case could stall lies in the narrative ambiguity itself. Without charges, the public cannot evaluate evidence. Without a suspect's name, accountability remains abstract. And without a clear explanation from authorities, the burden of storytelling shifts to social media, where emotion outruns verification. That environment benefits no one, except those who prefer confusion over clarity. And yet, even in that confusion, certain details refuse to fade. Khapri was reportedly unarmed. He was reportedly leaving. He was reportedly with his girlfriend. Those elements don't disappear just because a case remains open. They sit there unanswered, demanding context. If this were a clear-cut self-defense case, charges might still take time, but statements would follow. If it were an accident, explanations would surface. If it were a misunderstanding, officials would attempt to reassure the public. Instead, what we have is silence. And silence, when paired with custody, creates suspicion. There's also the issue of precedent. In similar cases across the country, when suspects with influence avoid immediate charges, families are often told to be patient. Patience, however, does not feel like justice when children are burying their father, when families are organizing vigils instead of receiving updates, when a grieving parent has to go on camera just to ensure their child's name isn't forgotten. Khapri Alston's father did not ask for revenge. He asked for fairness. He asked that political ties and money not determine whether his son's death mattered. That distinction is important. This is not about public outrage dictating guilt. It is about transparency ensuring trust. And trust in this case is fragile. Every day that passes without charges invites new questions. Was there surveillance footage? Were there witnesses? Were statements conflicting? Was alcohol involved? Were protocols followed? None of these questions accuse. They simply ask. And the longer they go unanswered, the louder they become. What makes this case even more painful is the contrast between who Khapri was and how his life ended. He spent years navigating professional sports environments across continents, places far more volatile than a suburban lounge, and emerged without scandal. He returned home to be present for his children. He was building a post-basketball life grounded in family. That trajectory matters because it undermines narratives that might attempt to frame him as reckless or confrontational without evidence. That framing is another reason families speak out early. Once a narrative takes hold, it is difficult to undo, and when the person who can defend themselves is gone, silence becomes dangerous. This is also why calls to shut the lounge down have gained traction online, not as punishment, but as prevention. When a business becomes the site of a fatal shooting tied to alleged mismanagement or escalation, the community has a right to demand review. Licenses exist to protect the public. Oversight exists to prevent harm. Those mechanisms mean nothing if they are not exercised. Still, it is important to separate accountability from assumption. Demanding investigation is not the same as declaring guilt. Calling for prosecution is not the same as deciding a verdict. The family understands that distinction, but they also understand something else. Once momentum is lost, it rarely returns. That is why visibility matters. That is why names are said out loud. That is why silence is challenged. And this is where the story stands right now. A man is dead. A suspect is in custody. No charges have been filed. A family is afraid. A community is watching. And the system is being tested in real time. What happens next will determine far more than the outcome of one case. It will determine whether residents believe justice is blind or selective, whether accountability applies equally or bends under pressure, whether a father's plea is answered or ignored. Khapri Alston's children will grow up knowing how loudly their family fought for him. The question is whether the system will respond with action or delay, whether transparency will replace silence, whether this case becomes another whispered warning or a moment of reckoning. Because justice does not require certainty on day one. It requires honesty. It requires process. And it requires the courage to treat every life as worthy of explanation, regardless of who is involved. As long as questions remain unanswered, as long as charges remain unfiled, and as long as influence remains a concern, this story is not over. It is unfolding, and the outcome will say more about the system than any statement ever could. Khapri Alston was a father, a son, a professional athlete, a man who came home. And until the truth is fully brought into the light, saying his name is not just remembrance, it is resistance. Khapri Alston, and the world is still waiting for answers.